All right, so um, Taiwan's new plan to tackle greenhouse gases over the next few years seems like there's a lot of interest in this, and we've got some stuff to dig into.
Yeah.
First up, we've got this FAQ document straight from the Taiwanese government, kind of like their, climate action cliff notes.
Right.
And then we've got these transcripts from a public hearing. It sounds like things got pretty lively.
Yeah. Looks like people had a lot to say. We'll try to, break it all down.
Exactly. So by the end, you'll know, what the plan is, what it could mean for Taiwan, and what the biggest, points of debate are.
Okay.
So first things first, Taiwan's goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 28%.
Give or take 2%.
Yeah, give or take 2% by 2030. And that's compared to their 2005 levels. Now, that sounds like a lot, but how does it actually compare?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Context is everything. When you compare Taiwan to some of their neighbors in Asia, like China and Singapore, who are actually expecting increases in emissions,
Oh, wow.
Taiwan's goal is, pretty ambitious.
Yep.
But on the other hand, and this is a big but, a lot of environmental groups are saying that it's still not enough to really line up with that global goal of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
So right away, you can see some tension
Mhm.
between what's possible politically and what's necessary scientifically.
Yeah, like walking a tightrope between, the economy and urgency of the environment.
Totally.
Let's get into the specifics of the plan. Break it down sector by sector,
Okay.
starting with energy.
Yeah.
They're aiming for a 23% reduction in emissions. And it seems like their strategy is mainly focused on changing up where their electricity comes from.
Yeah, and that's where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
By 2030, they want to have this mix of 30% renewables, 50% natural gas, and only 20% coal.
Wow.
And considering how much they rely on fossil fuels now, that is a big change.
Okay, but didn't we just say it's really important to keep warming to 1.5 degrees?
Right.
Isn't relying so heavily on natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel, kind of contradiction?
Yeah, and that is exactly what a lot of critics are pointing out. They're saying
Yeah.
that even though natural gas is cleaner than coal, it's not really going to get Taiwan on the path to, getting rid of carbon emissions in the long run.
All right.
It kind of feels like they're just postponing the problem, and it raises this big question. Should Taiwan be investing more in truly clean energy sources, even if it's more expensive or difficult in the short term?
So it sounds like the energy sector is already a big point of debate. What about manufacturing?
Yeah.
They're being asked to cut emissions by 18%, but some are saying that's not nearly enough given how much they contribute to the problem.
Oh, the government's argument is that Taiwan is such a big player in global supply chains. They make so much of the stuff that the world relies on. So they're saying deeper cuts would just wreck their economy.
Right.
This gets to a really fundamental question. Can Taiwan keep being a manufacturing powerhouse and still commit to a truly sustainable future? Maybe they need to completely rethink their industrial strategy, which is a tough thing to do.
Yeah. It's one thing to make small changes, but it's a whole other thing to completely change how your economy works. Okay, what about homes and commercial buildings?
Yeah.
They're aiming for a 35% reduction in emissions there, mainly by upgrading buildings and appliances to be more energy efficient. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm picturing a Taiwan where every balcony has a cute little solar panel, maybe in different colors to match people's decor.
I love that image. And actually, it's not that far-fetched.
Mm.
One interesting point from the public hearing transcript was this suggestion to incentivize people to install mini solar panels on their balconies and rooftops. Not only would this contribute to reducing emissions, but it could also help people get more familiar with solar energy and how it works. And it could even lead to the rise of these energy service companies, or ESCOs.
ESCOs, what are those?
They're like energy efficiency experts that you can hire.
Okay.
Imagine them helping homes, businesses, and even schools figure out how to cut down on energy waste and implement those upgrades the government's talking about.
Okay, so we've got energy, manufacturing, and buildings. What about getting around? How is Taiwan planning to deal with transportation emissions?
Well, their goal is a 20% reduction, and their plan is to get more people using public transit and to increase the number of electric vehicles on the road.
All right.
One thing they're really pushing is the TPS system. It's basically a monthly pass for unlimited use of buses and trains. They want to make public transportation so easy and affordable that people just ditch their cars.
So they're making it more appealing to go green.
Exactly.
All right, what about agriculture? They're aiming for a 35.1% reduction in emissions, focusing on sustainable farming practices, reducing livestock emissions, and boosting those natural systems that absorb CO2. What do they call them?
Carbon sinks.
Right, carbon sinks. It's a pretty ambitious target for a sector that's, responsible for feeding people.
It is ambitious and it's also complicated. What's unique about agriculture is that it both emits greenhouse gases and it removes them through those carbon sinks.
Right.
So it's a balancing act, trying to reduce emissions without messing up food security.
It's like trying to thread a needle. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the environment sector.
Okay.
Now, this one's interesting. They've already managed to cut emissions by a huge 70% since 2001, mainly by improving waste management.
That is impressive.
But, and this is a big but, they're being asked to do even more.
Yeah.
They're aiming for another 71.5% reduction by 2030.
Which kind of shows that the work of tackling climate change isn't always shared fairly.
Right. You can't just expect the groups that have already done the most to keep doing more.
Exactly.
It needs to be a group effort. Speaking of which, let's move on to the public hearing transcript, because that's where things seem to get interesting.
Yeah. It was a lot. It seems like they really dug into every part of the plan. And some of those discussions got pretty heated. It just shows you how complicated this all is. So many different points of view.
Yeah, it's not just about the numbers, right? It's about people's lives. What were some of the things that really stuck out to you?
Well, one big issue was the way the government presented the emissions reduction targets. There's this one environmental lawyer, Huang Shengwen, who really went after them for only giving a single-year target for 2030.
Oh.
Instead of, laying out a 5-year plan like they've done in the past. He was basically saying they're trying to hide the details.
So like a trust but verify thing. Show me the math behind that 28%.
Right. And he also brought up this idea of Taiwan's carbon budget, which is basically how much CO2 they can still emit before going over that 1.5-degree warming limit.
Yeah.
He said that if you look at it per person, Taiwan's current target would use up almost their entire carbon budget by 2030.
Wow. That's kind of scary. It makes it sound like even if they hit their target, they might still be in trouble later.
Yeah.
Did anyone else question how ambitious the plan really is?
Oh, yeah. Another lawyer, Kai Yang, pointed out that the choice of baseline year can really change things. She said that if you use the same baseline year as South Korea, which is 2018, Taiwan would actually need to aim for a 36% reduction to be comparable. So basically, she was saying the government might be playing with the numbers.
So it's not just the number itself, but also how did you get that number? It sounds like there were a lot of doubts about whether the government is being totally upfront.
For sure. And there was pushback on specific parts of the plan, too, especially relying so much on natural gas for energy. A lot of people said that this could trap Taiwan in a fossil fuel-dependent future, even if it's a little cleaner.
Okay.
They argue that the only real way to ditch fossil fuels is to put more money into renewables, even if it's harder at first.
Right. So back to that balancing act. Did anyone have any ideas for how to make the switch to renewable energy happen faster?
Well, one person, Wu Qingping, from the Homemakers United Foundation, suggested that the government should look beyond those huge industrial solar farms and, what do they call them?
Oh, the energy islands.
Yeah, those energy islands.
Right, the big offshore wind farms.
Exactly. She said there's a huge opportunity with distributed solar energy, meaning smaller installations like on homes and businesses.
So, giving regular people a way to get involved in making clean energy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She suggested giving incentives for people to put those mini solar panels on their balconies and rooftops. That would not only help with emissions, but it could also give people a chance to be a part of the solution, which might help them support the switch to renewables more.
Right, because just having a plan is one thing, but getting people excited about actually changing what they do is another. What about transportation? Any debate on how to get people to stop driving so much?
Definitely. Lots of people pointed out that just having electric cars isn't enough. You also have to reduce the need for cars in general.
Right.
That means putting money into public transit, making cities better for walking and biking, and designing cities so people don't need cars as much in the first place.
It's like that saying, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. If we really want to tackle climate change, we need to rethink how our cities and transportation systems work. Now, I remember reading something about the graphs and charts being misleading. Did anything like that come up at the hearing?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Hung Shuo-Chang from the Wild at Heart Ecology Association was really critical of the visuals and the presentations for energy and manufacturing. He was basically accusing the government of twisting the data to make the emissions cuts look bigger than they really are. He even compared it to that time when Taipower, the state-owned power company, was criticized for messing with data.
Yikes. Not good. Data can be really powerful, but it can also be used to, mislead people. So did the government respond at all?
Yeah, the chair of the session acknowledged those concerns and said the charts were just meant to be examples.
Right.
And that all the actual data was in the report. They said they'd review the visuals to avoid confusion, but a lot of people weren't convinced.
It shows how important it is to be clear and honest when you're talking about complicated issues like climate policy.
Exactly. If people don't believe the information, it's hard to get them on board, even if the plan is good.
Speaking of being upfront, were there other times when people wanted the government to be more open about how they're making these decisions?
Yeah, there was a lot of concern about how they chose the expert group that helped create the plan. Like, was it really transparent?
Okay.
One policy analyst, Lin Yanting, said the public hearing format wasn't good enough for real public input. They said the government needs to create a more open process for these kinds of policies in the future.
So people want a bigger say in climate action.
Right. Not just leaving it to the experts, but actually involving everyone who's going to be affected by these changes.
Makes sense. Were there any other concerns about, fairness and whether the burden of cutting emissions was being shared equally?
That was a big topic throughout the whole hearing. We already talked about how the environment sector has already done a lot to reduce emissions, but they're still being asked to do more.
Right, and it doesn't seem fair to expect them to do the most when other sectors, like manufacturing, haven't done as much.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Hong Shuo-Cheng, who we talked about earlier, brought up. Even though manufacturing makes the most emissions, they're only being asked to cut back by 18% compared to the overall 28% target. He said that wasn't fair, and that the responsibility should match how much each sector contributes to the problem.
So basically, if you pollute more, you got to clean up more. Makes sense. What did he suggest instead?
He said a more fair approach would be to require everyone to reduce emissions by at least 28% as a starting point, and then go from there based on what each sector can do.
Okay.
He also questioned why agriculture and the environment, which are so important for food and the environment, are being asked to cut so much more than energy and manufacturing.
Yeah.
It was a really strong point that showed the need to think about not just the environment, but also fairness when making climate policies.
Yeah, we need to remember that fixing climate change shouldn't mean we have to choose between clean energy and having enough food or a healthy environment. It sounds like the government got a lot of feedback at that hearing.
Oh, they definitely did. It was messy and people didn't always agree. But it also showed that people care about this. They're asking the tough questions and they're pushing for a plan that's more ambitious and fair.
It reminds us that democracy isn't always perfect, but it's important so everyone gets a chance to be heard and decisions are made with everyone's input, not just the people in charge. Okay, so we've talked about specific concerns and the need for transparency and fairness, but what about the big picture? Did anyone question whether Taiwan's whole economic model needs to change? Because it's all about growth and using up resources.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Someone from Greenpeace, Shen Yizhen, brought up greenwashing, basically saying the government's too focused on quick fixes instead of really dealing with, why climate change is happening in the first place, our obsession with always buying more stuff.
So is it just putting a green sticker on things, or are they really going to make big changes? Did anyone else have that concern about Taiwan's focus on growth?
Yeah, several people did. They said that a truly sustainable future for Taiwan means moving away from this idea that the economy has to keep growing forever, especially if it's hurting the environment.
That's a pretty big idea, right? Everything is about economic growth.
It is a huge change, no doubt. But more and more people are asking these questions. Can we have a good life without always using more stuff? What would an economy that isn't about constant growth even look like? These are things Taiwan, and honestly the whole world, needs to think about.
It feels like we have a choice to make. Either we keep doing what we're doing and deal with the consequences, or we try something totally different.
And that's what makes this whole discussion about Taiwan's climate plan so interesting. It's not just about cutting emissions, it's about figuring out what really matters to us.
Right. Okay, we've covered a lot. The targets, the different parts of the plan, what the public thinks, the big questions. So what are the main things for our listener to take away from all this?
Taiwan's plan to cut greenhouse gases is pretty ambitious, especially compared to what other countries in the region are doing.
Right.
But there are some big challenges. Limits with technology, needing everyone to work together, and people not trusting the details, and maybe even their whole economic model being part of the problem.
And even if they reach all their goals, it still might not be enough to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And they have to make sure that going green doesn't hurt anyone.
Exactly. So it's not just about whether Taiwan can meet these goals, it's about what kind of future they want to build. What kind of place do they want to be as the climate changes?
That's a great question to leave our listener with. This was just a quick look at a really complex issue, but hopefully it got you thinking. We'll put links to the government's FAQ and that public hearing transcript in the show notes so you can check them out.
And we'd love to hear what you think. What parts of this plan stood out to you? What questions does it raise for Taiwan or even for the rest of the world? Let us know. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious.